In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, during the winter of 1873, the German immigrant community spoke about 11-year-old Emma Richter in hushed, fearful tones. This quiet, pale child could, within seconds, calculate the day of the week for any date in human history, memorize entire conversations word for word after a single hearing, and recite the precise number of steps between any two buildings in her neighborhood. To the people of 1873, what modern science would recognize as an extraordinary neurological condition was either a divine blessing or something far more sinister. The community's amazement turned to terror, however, when Emma began to use her remarkable abilities to reveal buried secrets, predict deadly accidents, and recite intimate details of crimes that supposedly no living person had witnessed. By spring, 3 men would be dead. A family would flee in the night. And Emma Richter herself would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only a leather journal filled with numbers that no one dared to decode. Before we continue with the chilling story of Emma Richter and the dark secrets her extraordinary mind uncovered in Milwaukee's German Quarter, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most haunting historical mysteries every week. And let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. These stories happened in communities just like yours, often closer to home than you might think. The residents of Brewery Town did not yet realize that Emma's gift would expose a web of lies, murder, and betrayal that had been carefully hidden for nearly a decade, and that her mathematical precision would become their community's most terrifying nightmare. Life in the German Quarter. In 1873, Milwaukee's German Quarter was a bustling enclave marked by modest wooden homes, red brick breweries, and the constant sound of German voices mixing with English in the crisp Wisconsin air. This community of nearly 8,000 German immigrants had successfully transplanted the familiar rhythms of Old World life to American soil, building their own little Bavaria along the shores of Lake Michigan, complete with traditional bakeries and beer gardens. The men worked in the breweries, Schlitz, Best, and the dozens of smaller operations that made Milwaukee famous, while their wives tended gardens that yielded the same vegetables their grandmothers had grown in the Rhineland. Heinrich and Greta Richter had arrived from Bavaria in 1861 with their infant daughter, Emma, and dreams of prosperity. Heinrich secured steady work as a brew master at the Kellner Brewery, a mid-sized operation that supplied beer to the growing city's thirsty population. Greta took in mending and laundry to supplement their income, her nimble fingers working by candlelight long after Emma had been put to bed in their tidy but small home on Galena Street. In every way, the Richters were unremarkable, except for their daughter. The unsettling child. Emma had been born 3 weeks premature during the harsh Atlantic crossing, so small that the ship's doctor doubted she would survive the journey. She did survive, though she remained pale and slight, with enormous grey eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with unsettling intensity. As a toddler, she rarely cried or demanded attention, content instead to sit quietly in corners, watching and listening as the adult world unfolded. By age 4, Emma's parents began to notice something unusual. She could recite entire conversations she had overheard days earlier, complete with the speaker's precise accents and inflections. She counted everything, the steps from their front door to the bakery, the number of stitches in her mother's embroidery, the exact time between the brewery whistles that marked the beginning and end of each workday. When Heinrich taught her basic arithmetic, she absorbed mathematical concepts with frightening speed, solving problems in her head faster than he could work them out on paper. The German community initially viewed Emma's abilities with a mixture of unease and pride. Old Mrs. Brennan, who claimed to remember the witch trials from her grandmother's stories, crossed herself whenever Emma's calculating grey eyes fixed on her. But Father Koller, the stout Bavarian priest who served their small Catholic parish, declared Emma's gifts to be a blessing from God, a child chosen to demonstrate divine wisdom in their New World community. The darker character of observation. The winter of 1872 had been particularly harsh, temperatures dropped so low that for the first time in a generation, Lake Michigan froze solid. The brewery workers huddled around coal stoves, their breath visible even indoors, while their wives struggled to keep their families fed and warm through the long, bitter months. It was during this isolated winter that Emma's abilities began to take on a darker character, though no one yet understood what was coming. Emma had developed the habit of sitting by the small kitchen window, watching the neighbors go about their daily routines with the same intense focus she applied to mathematical problems. She began to notice patterns, not just in numbers, but in human behavior. Mr. Kruger always walked to the brewery by the same route, taking exactly 247 steps, except on Wednesdays when a different path required 284 steps. Mrs. Fisher hung her laundry in a specific sequence, but when her husband worked late at the mill, she changed the order completely. These observations might have been dismissed as the quirks of an unusual child, except that Emma began to vocalize her findings in ways that made the adults increasingly uncomfortable. The first prediction. The transformation from curiosity to dread began on a grey February morning in 1873. Emma was methodically eating her breakfast at the kitchen table while her mother prepared her father's lunch pail. She suddenly looked up and announced, "Mr. Dietrich will not come home from the brewery today. He will die at exactly 14 minutes past 2 o'clock. Greta nearly dropped the tin pail she was holding. "Emma, mind God, what a terrible thing to say. Why would you think such a thing?" Emma's grey eyes remained fixed on her mother's face with that unsettling intensity. "He has been drinking from the small brown bottle for 17 days. Yesterday, he drank 3 times more than usual. His steps were uneven, 251 instead of his normal 244. When people change their patterns by more than 10%, something significant happens within 72 hours. Mr. Dietrich's pattern changed by 12%. The calculation is simple. Hinrich, who had been putting on his heavy wool coat, stopped and stared at his daughter. Jon Dietrich was indeed a drinker, but no more so than half the men in the German quarter. The idea that Emma had been tracking his drinking habits and counting his steps was disturbing enough, but her calm mathematical certainty about his death sent a chill through both parents that had nothing to do with the Wisconsin winter. "You must not say such things, Emma," Hinrich said firmly. "It's not proper for a child to speak of death." Emma simply nodded and returned to her breakfast, but her parents exchanged worried glances over her bent head. They had grown accustomed to their daughter's unusual observations, but this felt different, more specific and darker than her typical mathematical pronouncements. At precisely 14 minutes past 2 that afternoon, Jon Dietrich collapsed in the brewery's malt room. The official cause of death was heart failure brought on by what Dr. Mer determined to be chronic alcohol poisoning. The brewery workers who found him noted he had been acting strangely for weeks, drinking more heavily than usual and showing signs of severe anxiety. But what truly unsettled them was the timing. Emma Richter's prediction had been accurate to the minute. Whispers and dread. Word of Emma's grim prophecy spread through the German quarter like smoke from a chimney fire. Some dismissed it as coincidence, but others remembered the pale girl with the calculating eyes and began to wonder what else she might have observed during her silent vigils at the kitchen window. The Richter family found themselves the subject of sideways glances and whispered conversations when they visited the market or walked to church. Father Koller, who had previously praised Emma's gifts as divine, now seemed less certain. When Hinrich approached him after Sunday Mass, seeking guidance about his daughter's disturbing prediction, the priest's jovial demeanor had been replaced by something approaching concern. "Hinrich, my friend," Father Koller said, his Bavarian accent thick with worry. "Perhaps it would be best if young Emma spent less time watching the neighbors and more time with her prayers. The Lord gives us gifts, yes, but sometimes the devil can twist even the most innocent abilities toward darker purposes." This suggestion troubled Hinrich deeply. He was a practical man, more concerned with the science of brewing than the mysteries of faith. But even he could not dismiss the unsettling accuracy of Emma's prediction. That evening he sat his daughter down for a serious conversation. "Emma, you must tell me the truth. How did you know about Mr. Dietrich?" Emma looked at her father with those enormous grey eyes, her expression as calm and analytical as always. "I watch, I count, I remember." Mr. Dietrich's behavior changed in predictable ways. When someone increases their alcohol consumption by 37% over a 17-day period while simultaneously reducing their food intake by approximately 20%, cardiac stress becomes inevitable. I calculated the most probable time of failure based on his age, weight, and observed symptoms. Hinrich felt his blood run cold. His 11-year-old daughter was speaking like a physician, or something far more troubling. "But Emma, how could you know all these details about Mr. Dietrich eating and drinking?" "I observe everything, Papa, every day, every person, every pattern. Emma's voice remained matter-of-fact, but there was something in her eyes that made Heinrich deeply uncomfortable. Would you like me to tell you about the other calculations I've made? Heinrich quickly shook his head. He did not want to know what else his daughter had calculated about their neighbors' lives and deaths. But as he tucked Emma into bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that his family was standing at the edge of something much darker than a simple mathematical curiosity. The February snow continued to fall outside their small house, muffling the sounds of the German Quarter and creating an insulated world where observations could be made without detection and secrets could be hidden. Emma lay quietly in her narrow bed, her mathematical mind processing the day's data and calculating probabilities that number 11-year-old should be able to comprehend, and certainly number 11-year-old should want to know. The web of lies. In the weeks following Jon Dietrich's death, the atmosphere in Milwaukee's German Quarter shifted like the wind off Lake Michigan. Emma continued her daily observations, but now her parents watched her with growing unease as she sat by the kitchen window, her grey eyes tracking the movements of their neighbors with mechanical precision. The child, who had once been their pride, had become a source of deep, knowing worry. The brewing community was tight-knit by necessity. The men relied on each other for work, their wives for companionship during the long winters, and their children played together in the narrow streets between the red brick buildings. But Emma had never quite fit into this social fabric. While other children played games and told stories, she preferred to sit alone, calculating and counting and watching the world around her with that unsettling intensity. Greta began to notice that Emma's observations were becoming more detailed and more disturbing. The child would mention casually that Mrs. Weber had been meeting secretly with Mr. Kellner behind the brewery on Tuesday afternoons for 6 weeks, or that the Schneider family had been burying something in their back garden every Sunday after church. When Greta asked how Emma could possibly know such things, the girl would simply explain that she had observed the patterns and calculated the probabilities. "People think they are being secret," Emma said one March morning as she methodically buttered her bread. "But they follow patterns just like numbers. Mrs. Weber always tells her husband she's visiting her sister on Tuesday afternoons, but she takes 127 steps to Mr. Kellner's house instead of 349 steps to her sister's. The Schneiders bury objects wrapped in cloth exactly 73 centimeters apart in a grid pattern. They believe no one is watching, but I am always watching." Heinrich had heard enough. That evening, after Emma was asleep, he spoke seriously with his wife about their daughter's increasingly troubling behavior. "Greta, this cannot continue. Emma is becoming unnatural. Children should not observe such things, and they certainly should not speak of them so coldly." Greta nodded, her hands trembling as she mended one of Heinrich's work shirts. "I'm frightened, Heinrich. Not of Emma, but of what people will think. Already the neighbors look at us strangely. Mrs. Brennan crossed the street yesterday when she saw me coming. And Father Koller, he has not visited us since Yang's death. Convergence of variables." Their fears proved justified 3 days later when Emma made another of her mathematical announcements. She was helping her mother prepare dinner when she suddenly stopped peeling potatoes and looked up with that familiar calculating expression. "Mrs. Weber will be discovered tomorrow at 11 in the morning. Her husband will find her with Mr. Kellner in the brewery office. There will be violence." Greta dropped her paring knife. "Emma, Nain, you must not say such things." But Emma continued with the same mathematical certainty she applied to her arithmetic lessons. "Mrs. Weber has been arriving at the brewery 7 minutes earlier each week for 6 weeks. Mr. Kellner has been staying 33 minutes later each day. Tomorrow, Mr. Weber will return from his delivery route 47 minutes early because his horse is developing lameness in her left front leg. I have observed her gait deteriorating for 11 days. The convergence of these 3 variables makes discovery inevitable." Heinrich, who had been listening from the doorway, felt his chest tighten with dread. His daughter was not just observing their neighbors. She was predicting their futures with terrifying accuracy. "Emma, how do you know about Mr. Weber's horse?" "I count her steps when she passes our house. On March 1st, she favored her right legs 53% of the time. Today, it was 68%. Tomorrow, the lameness will be severe enough to slow the delivery route by 47 minutes, causing Mr. Weber to return early. The next day unfolded exactly as Emma had calculated. Wilhelm Weber discovered his wife Anna in a compromising position with brewery owner Ernst Kellner. The confrontation that followed left Kellner with a broken nose and 3 cracked ribs, while Anna was beaten so severely that Dr. Müller had to be summoned. The scandal rocked the tight-knit German community. But what disturbed people even more was the growing realization that little Emma Richter had somehow predicted the entire sequence of events. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. The pale girl with the mathematical mind had not only predicted Johann Dietrich's death, but had also foreseen the Weber-Kellner scandal with unsettling precision. The growing isolation. People began to whisper about the strange child who sat at her window, watching and calculating and somehow knowing things that no child should know. The Richter family found themselves increasingly isolated. Former friends avoided them at church. Children were forbidden from playing near their house, and even the shopkeepers in the German quarter began to treat them with barely concealed suspicion. Hinrich's position at the brewery became tenuous. His fellow workers viewed him with unease, and Ernst Kellner, still recovering from his beating, made it clear that the Richter family was no longer welcome at company social events. But Emma seemed oblivious to the growing hostility around her. She continued her daily observations, her mathematical mind processing data and calculating probabilities with mechanical precision. She began keeping a leather journal, filling its pages with dates, numbers, and observations that her parents dared not read. The sight of their 11-year-old daughter bent over her calculations, writing in neat columns of figures, filled them with a dread they could not name. As winter gave way to spring, the isolation deepened. The German quarter that had once felt like home now seemed hostile and threatening. Hinrich began to consider the unthinkable, leaving Milwaukee, abandoning the life they had built, and starting over somewhere far from the fear and the whispers and the terrible accuracy of their daughter's predictions. But Emma was not finished with her calculations. The worst was yet to come, and her mathematical mind had already begun processing the data that would lead to the darkest secrets of all. The doctor's examination. As April arrived in Milwaukee, bringing with it the first tentative warmth after the brutal winter, Emma's journal grew thicker with her precise notations. The leather-bound book had become her constant companion, and she filled its pages with increasingly complex calculations that went far beyond simple mathematics. Her parents caught glimpses of tables of numerical sequences they couldn't understand, charts tracking human behavior patterns, and detailed maps of the German quarter marked with measurements and symbols. The community's fear of Emma had begun to manifest in more concrete ways. Children were forbidden from walking past the Richter house. Shopkeepers served the family quickly and without conversation, and even Father Koller had begun limiting his interactions with them to formal church services. But Emma's isolation only seemed to sharpen her observational skills, as if the removal of normal social distractions allowed her unusual mind to focus more intently on the mathematical patterns she perceived in human behavior. Dr. Friedrich Müller, the community's physician, had grown increasingly curious about Emma's abilities. Unlike the superstitious whispers of the neighbors, Dr. Müller approached the situation with scientific interest. He had studied medicine in Berlin before immigrating to America and had encountered cases of unusual mental capabilities in his practice. When Heinrich Richter approached him privately, seeking medical advice about his daughter's condition, Dr. Müller agreed to examine Emma. The examination took place on a rainy Thursday morning in Dr. Miller's office above the pharmacy on Water Street. Emma submitted to the doctor's questions and tests with the same mathematical precision she applied to everything else, answering each inquiry with detailed accuracy, while her grey eyes remained fixed on some invisible calculation. "Emma," Dr. Müller said in his accented English, "your father tells me you can predict when certain events will happen. Can you explain to me how you do this?" Emma looked at the doctor with that unsettling intensity. "I observe patterns and calculate probabilities based on established behavioral data. People believe their actions are random, but they follow mathematical sequences. When I have sufficient data points, I can predict future behavior with high accuracy." Dr. Müller leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Can you give me an example?" Emma consulted her journal, flipping through pages of neat numerical notations. "Mrs. Brennan believes she is keeping a secret, but her pattern is quite obvious." Every Tuesday and Friday for 8 weeks, she has walked to the church at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon. But instead of entering for prayer, she continues to the rectory and remains for precisely 43 minutes. Father Kohler's pattern has also changed. He has been purchasing extra wine and candles, and his evening prayers have extended by an average of 17 minutes on Tuesdays and Fridays. The correlation is statistically significant. Dr. Mueller felt his breath catch. The methodical way she had documented her observations was deeply troubling, but the implications of what Emma was suggesting about the widow and the priest were scandalous enough. "Emma, how long have you been watching people in this way?" "Always," Emma replied simply. "Since I was very small, but I only began making calculations when I learned mathematics." The patterns became clearer then. The fire calculation. After the examination, Dr. Mueller spoke privately with Heinrich and Greta Richter. His medical training told him that Emma's condition was neurological rather than supernatural, but he had no framework for understanding what he had observed. "Your daughter's mind works differently than other children's," he explained. "She processes information in ways that seem almost mechanical. In my opinion, this is a medical condition, not the other things people are saying." But even Dr. Mueller's scientific perspective couldn't diminish the growing dread that surrounded Emma's predictions. 2 days after his examination, Emma made another of her calculated announcements. There will be a fire at the Zimmerman house on Sunday evening. It will start at 8:47 and spread to 3 adjacent buildings before the volunteer fire brigade can respond. Mr. Zimmerman will not survive. Heinrich felt the familiar chill that accompanied his daughter's predictions. "Emma, you must not say such things. How could you possibly know about a fire?" Emma consulted her journal. "Mr. Zimmerman has been drinking lamp oil mixed with whiskey for 12 days. I observed him purchasing both items in quantities that exceed normal household use. His wife left for Chicago to visit her sister yesterday, which follows the pattern of wives leaving before significant domestic incidents occur. The chimney on their house has structural damage that I calculated based on the pattern of soot deposits and the angle of smoke emission. The probability of fire is 93%. Greta began to weep softly. The clinical way Emma discussed potential tragedy, as if human suffering were simply another mathematical problem to be solved, frightened her more than any supernatural explanation would have. This was her child, but she no longer recognized the mechanical way she processed human pain or the cold precision in Emma's voice. Heinrich made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided to warn Franz Zimmermann about Emma's prediction, hoping that preventive action might save a life and perhaps demonstrate that his daughter's calculations could be used for good rather than simply predicting disaster. He found Zimmermann at the brewery Saturday evening, stumbling drunkenly and reeking of the lamp oil Emma had mentioned. Heinrich's warning was met with belligerent laughter and crude jokes about the devil child who thinks she knows everything. But something in Heinrich's desperation must have penetrated Zimmermann's alcoholic haze because he promised to be extra careful with the lamps. Precision of disaster. Sunday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth and a dry wind from the west. At exactly 8:47, flames erupted from the Zimmerman house. The fire spread with terrifying speed, consuming not just the original building, but 3 adjacent homes before the volunteer fire brigade could mount an effective response. Franz Zimmermann's body was found in his kitchen, where he had apparently fallen while trying to extinguish flames that had spread far beyond his ability to control. The accuracy of Emma's prediction down to the exact minute sent shock waves through the German quarter. Heinrich's attempt to warn Zimmermann had been witnessed by several brewery workers, and word spread quickly that Emma had predicted not just the fire, but its precise consequences and timing. The community's unease transformed into open fear, and the Richter family found themselves completely ostracized. But for Emma, the fire was simply another data point to be recorded in her journal. She noted the correlation between her prediction and the actual event, made adjustments to her calculations based on the observed variables, and began processing new patterns with the same mechanical precision that had made her prediction possible in the first place. The worst part was that she was not finished calculating. The breaking point. The days following the Zimmerman fire transformed the German quarter into a place of sideways glances and whispered fears. Emma's prediction had been too detailed, too precise, and too accurate to be dismissed as coincidence. 3 families, the Kohlers, the Bronzes, and the Steiners, had lost their homes in the blaze, and the community was struggling to house the displaced families while trying to process the unsettling reality of Emma's mathematical prophecies. Heinrich found his position at the brewery had become untenable. His fellow workers avoided him. Conversation stopped when he entered a room, and Ernst Kellner, still bearing the marks of Wilhelm Weber's attack, made it clear that the Richter family's presence was no longer welcome in any brewery social functions. The mathematical precision of Emma's predictions had transformed their daughter from a curiosity into something the community feared to name. Emma herself seemed unaware of the growing hostility around her. She continued her daily observations, filling page after page of her leather journal with calculations that grew increasingly complex and disturbing. She had begun creating what appeared to be probability matrices, tracking multiple variables simultaneously, and generating predictions that extended weeks into the future. Greta found herself afraid to look at her daughter's journal, terrified of what calculations Emma might be making about neighbors or their own family. The child who had once been her greatest joy had become a source of constant anxiety. Emma's clinical observations about people's most private behaviors, her matter-of-fact discussions of human tragedy, and her mechanical processing of information that should have evoked emotional responses, all contributed to a growing sense that something fundamental had been lost or damaged in her daughter's mind. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late April. Emma was sitting at her usual place by the kitchen window, watching the street activity with her characteristic intensity, when she suddenly looked up at her mother with those calculating grey eyes. "Mama, there is something wrong with the pattern today." Greta, who was preparing bread for baking, felt her hands begin to tremble. "What do you mean, Emma?" Emma consulted her journal, flipping through pages of numerical notations with practiced efficiency. Every Tuesday for 11 weeks, Mrs. Brennan has walked to the rectory at exactly 3:15. But today, she left her house at 2:47 and walked toward the river instead. Her behavior indicates significant distress. Her step length decreased by 12%, and her breathing pattern was irregular. This suggests she is planning something final. The clinical way Emma discussed Mrs. Brennan's apparent suicidal intentions filled Greta with horror. "Emma, you must not speak of such things. Mrs. Brennan is a good woman. She would never." "The mathematical probability is 87%, Emma interrupted with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. "People who dramatically alter established behavioral patterns while displaying physical signs of distress typically execute irreversible decisions within 4 hours of the pattern change. Mrs. Brennan's pattern changed 43 minutes ago." Greta felt the world tilting around her. The realization that her 11-year-old daughter was calmly predicting a neighbor's suicide with mathematical precision was more than she could bear. She dropped her bread dough and ran to find Heinrich, who was in their small garden behind the house trying to find some normalcy in the simple act of preparing soil for spring planting. "Heinrich, you must come quickly. Emma says Mrs. Brennan is going to harm herself. We must do something." The intervention. Heinrich looked at his wife's terrified face and felt the familiar dread that had become their constant companion. They found Emma still sitting by the window, making additional notations in her journal as if recording a scientific observation rather than predicting a human tragedy. "Emma, tell me exactly what you observed about Mrs. Brennan." Emma looked up from her calculations. She deviated from her established Tuesday pattern by 28 minutes. Her physical indicators suggested severe emotional distress. Based on historical data about behavioral pattern disruption, the probability of self-harm is 87%, with peak likelihood occurring between 5 and 7 this evening. Heinrich made a decision that revealed both his desperation and his growing acceptance of Emma's abilities. He left the house immediately and went searching for Margaret Brennan, following the route toward the river that Emma had indicated. He found the elderly widow standing on the dock where the fishing boats tied up, staring into the dark water with an expression of profound despair. "Mrs. Brennan," Heinrich called softly, approaching carefully so as not to startle her. "Are you all right?" The elderly woman turned toward him, her eyes red with tears. "Heinrich, what are you doing here? I was concerned about you. You seem troubled lately." Mrs. Brennan's face crumpled. I cannot bear it any more, Heinrich. The knowledge that everyone knows about my weakness, the shame, the whispers. Father Koller says it is sin, but I cannot help what I feel for him. Better to end it than to live with this disgrace. Heinrich realized with growing horror that Emma's observations about Mrs. Brennan and Father Koller had been accurate, and that the elderly woman was indeed contemplating suicide rather than face the scandal. He spent the next 2 hours talking Margaret Brennan away from the river, convincing her that shame was not worth dying for and that the community's judgment would eventually fade. When he returned home that evening, he found Emma making final notations in her journal. Mrs. Brennan did not follow through with her plan, she observed clinically. The intervention changed the probability calculation. I will need to adjust my variables for future predictions involving third-party interference. Heinrich stared at his daughter in disbelief. Emma had somehow observed and calculated a suicide attempt that had not yet occurred. And now she was treating his intervention as simply another data point to be incorporated into her mathematical models. The realization that his 11-year-old daughter was not just predicting tragic events, but studying human suffering with scientific detachment filled him with a horror he could not name. That night, as Emma slept peacefully in her narrow bed, Heinrich and Greta made a decision that would change their lives forever. They could not continue living in Milwaukee. Emma's abilities, whatever they were, had made their life in the German Quarter impossible. But more troubling was the growing realization that their daughter was not just observing and calculating human behavior, but seemed to be losing touch with the emotional reality of the tragedies she predicted. They began making quiet plans to leave Wisconsin, to find some place where Emma could live without being feared, and where her unusual mind might find a different outlet. But Emma was not finished with her calculations, and the most disturbing revelations were yet to come. As Heinrich lay awake that night, listening to the sounds of the German Quarter settling into sleep, he could not shake the feeling that his daughter's mathematical mind